In a previous video, I showed you how we can rework and slightly reshape a simple frequency table in order to add percentages, in order for us to tell our readers what is the relative contribution of each category toward the total. And as I told you, we can use this slightly reshaped table as a basis for a visualization. On my screen, you can see a pie chart, which is a type of visualization, a type of graph that we can employ to visually represent the content of a frequency table. And as you may know, a pie chart is represented by a circle, and each sector or each slice of the pie corresponds to a category in our corresponding frequency table, and the size of each slice is proportional to the percentage that corresponds to any given category. So, for example, to stick with our example of the analysis of students' preferred method of transport to college, we can see that bicycle correspond to this slice, to this large blue slice, and it corresponds to 30%. Bus is the second largest category and correspond to 24%, and in the pie chart correspond to this smaller red slice, and so on and so forth for the other categories. So when you want to compare categories, when you want to visually represent a simple frequency table, the most widespread option and the most used option and the most well-known option is a pie chart, which can be easily obtained in Excel or in any other statistical program. And this is just to show you how we can obtain this from Excel. It's quite straightforward, but I will not cover this in this short video. I wanted to instead to cover some good practices and bad practices in the use of pie charts. I want to give you some suggestions as to the good practices and bad practices that we should follow and avoid when we build our pie charts. Usually, it's better if our pie chart starts with the first slice starting from 12 o'clock position. This is something which is done by default by any statistical program, so this is not a real issue, but just for you to know, it's better if the first slice starts with the left side, like in this chart, at 12 o'clock. Sometimes we can arrange our sectors, our slices, in either increasing or decreasing order to improve readability of our chart and to enhance comparability. And this can be achieved by arranging either in decreasing or increasing order the table, the frequency table on which the pie chart is based. And in this case, you can see that car is the largest slice, which is followed by the second largest, the third largest, etc. So this improves enhanced readability and allow us to compare the slices to one another. Of course, we have to keep in mind that if our categories have an implicit ordering, we don't have to sort the rows of our frequency table in any other order. Let me show you an example. This chart here is a chart representing the proportion of married population by age. So those categories do have an implicit ordering. They go from 15 to 29, from 30 to 44, from 45 to 59, from 60 to 74, and then 75 plus. So those categories do have already an implicit ordering. So in this case, it is a good practice not breaking the order, the implicit ordering among them. And so in this case, we have to leave the ordering of those categories as it is. Another advice about bad practices to avoid is about the use of 3D charts and 3D graphs. Of course, they are visually appealing, but sometimes they can be misleading. So I can suggest you to think twice about using 3D charts, either 3D pie charts or 3D bar charts or both. As you can see in this example, we have this 3D pie chart. Of course, every slice is representing a given proportion of a given category. But let's focus on this second and sixth category. As you can see, this one, this pink category corresponds to 12%, while this one corresponds to 14%. But because of the perspective of the 3D graph, this slice that represents a smaller category, a smaller proportion, looks larger than this one that represents a larger proportion. And the same applies to this small third and fifth category, corresponding respectively to 4 and 5%. So as you can see, a 3D pie chart can be visually appealing, but is providing us with a deceiving image of the data. So if you can, and if you want, try to avoid 3D graphs and just stick with 2D graphs, bar charts, pie charts, or any other type of chart. And then there is another bad practice to avoid, is cluttering your visualization with long labels, with lots of small categories, all close to one another when it comes to the proportion. As you can see in this chart, we have just two main categories, and then a lot of small categories with representing percentages that are really close to one another. And on top of that, we have very long labels. So in this case, the chart is barely readable, and it doesn't convey its message in a very straightforward way. So if you find yourself in this situation, in this case, it's better to provide a nicely organized table than an ugly chart. We can sometimes we have to report by words our findings. So let's stick with the example of the preferred method of transport of students. We can shortly report our findings and describing our data in the following way. We start with a broad statement. We want to investigate the method of transport of university students. And then we make reference to our data. So we collect a random sample of 50 individuals, and we ask about the method of transport they prefer. The frequency table reports the number of students falling in each category of our categorical variable, which is the method of transport variable. And then we can explicitly report the steps that we took. So we can say, since there is no implicit ordering in the transport categories, the latter have been sorted in descending order of counts. Percentages have been added to make evident the contribution of each method of transport to the total. And then we can proceed describing our percentages. So we can say the transport category with the highest frequency is bicycle. 30% of students use this method. And then going to university by foot and by bus correspond to 24% and 18% respectively, and so on and so forth. So we can describe our categories in a way that makes sense. And then we can end our small report with an overall statement. Overall, bicycle, foot, and bus together correspond to the largest part of the sample, 30% plus 24 plus 18, which correspond to 72%. In other words, the first three transport categories account for 72% of the overall method of transport. Of course, we can use other types of visualization. For example, a bar chart. A bar chart is like a pie chart, which is employing bars instead of slices. The choice is up to you. Sometimes if we want to make categories comparable to one another, sometimes it's better to use a pie chart. Other people prefer bar charts. So the choice sometimes is subjective. And we can employ the same strategies described so far. We can use the counts as a basis for our bar chart, or we can plot the percentages. And we can leave the categories unsorted, for example, in this case, sorted in alphabetical order, or we can, for example, sort them in either increasing or decreasing order by sorting the rows of the table on which the chart is based. So those are the options. I've given a number of hints when it comes to best and bad practices.